Please open your hearts and your ears to this reading from Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia. Queerness is not here yet. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us, an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. Then, here and now is a prison house. The here and now is a prison house. We must strive in the face of the here and now's totalizing rendering of reality, to think and feel a then and there. Some will say that all we have are the pleasures of this moment, but we must never settle for that minimal transport. We must dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately, new worlds. Queerness is a longing that propels us forward and onward, beyond romances of the negative and toiling in the present. Queerness is that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. And now for our second reading, it comes from the book of Jeremiah. Hear God's holy word. I alone know the plans I have for you, plans to bring you prosperity and not disaster, plans to bring about the future you hope for.
I want to first express gratitude to everyone here at MCC Boston that allowed me to speak today and on this very special occasion for our church. It is an immense honor for me to be able to stand before you on the 53rd anniversary of MCC, our United Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Church, and reflect on some of the history of our denomination, and most importantly, reflect together on where we are headed as a denomination. MCC, like most, if not all of our congregant members, holds a very special place in our hearts, as it has been a pivotal part of many of our queer journeys of acceptance of our multifaceted identities. I think in the past couple of years since I was a part of MCC Boston, I heard stories from Mark and Paul about how they first encountered MCC through the offering call Mark does every week. And through the sermons of Alan, I heard a little bit of his own journey to MCC Boston. A common theme found in these stories, and also the stories told by many, many MCC church members around the world, is that MCC has been a place where LGBTQ+ people of faith felt safe, comfortable, and welcomed to explore both their sexualities and religious identities, especially as we were often rejected from our previous places of worship. I truly think that it is so amazing how Reverend Troy Perry's vision to create this place where we, as LGBTQ+ folks, would be able to explore our religious identities safely has held true for 53 years, and that we are able to continually come to MCC weekly to worship and be in community together. Of course, this journey to MCC also includes me. I thought, learned, researched, experienced, and wrote a lot about MCC, especially as it has been both an important place for me to accept my sexuality as a gay person, but also explore my religious identity freely. Even though I am a bit younger than the rest of the congregation, The sad reality is that I too first came to MCC as a hurt, broken, and outcasted gay person. I remember I first encountered MCC in 2016 after I was kicked out of a large church in New York City. This happened after the pastor of this specific church and I had a very super awkward conversation where the pastor told me basically that this liberal church still practiced the love the sinner, hate the sin belief. Shocked, I remember being furious that a church in a place like New York City still held beliefs like this. That's when I was first introduced to MCC in New York by my academic advisor at the time, who was like an older gay mentor of mine. From my first time at MCC, I understood that this was the place that I was meant to be, as it was the only religious space where I felt most comfortable. After years of attending MCC in New York, I had the privilege of writing my college thesis on the MCC location in San Francisco, where I looked through their digital archives to understand how MCC in San Francisco was able to support the LGBTQ+ community in the area during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. After graduating college, I moved to Boston, and I remember my first time at MCC Boston, seeing the rainbow flags outside and being welcomed by Mark at the door, and the rest is history. When thinking about what I wanted to speak about today, I kept reflecting back to my own journey at MCC, and I kept thinking of this idea of futurity. But not just any futurity, but this idea of a queer futurity or the possibility of a future in queerness. Maybe it was because I'm currently in the process of writing my thesis again, but this time at the Divinity School, where the theme of queer futurity is, of course, a prominent one. Or also maybe it has been because, to me, MCC has always signified a place where a queer future was and is possible. Queer futurity has been an important and crucial theme in my life, not only, as many of our congregant members know, because there was a period of time in my life where I thought I had no future, like a lot of LGBTQ folks. MCC, when I was broken, was the only place where I felt accepted and seen, and a place where I understood that I did, in fact, have a future. But outside my own personal story, I think that queer futurity has also been a pivotal theme all throughout MCC's history. If you have noticed, one of the texts that we read today was not from the Bible, but from a text written by a queer scholar, Jose Esteban Munoz. This queer theorist was a professor at NYU, where I went to college, and have become some sort of icon in both the queer academic sphere and also amongst younger queer people, as his vision of a queer future continues to bring hope to many people. While the Bible verse that I have chosen today has been used by Christians and the church as a signifier of the promised future that God gives us, I thought this text by Munoz helps add on to the biblical text and think about the promised queer future that MCC has given us. The queer future that perhaps our belief, faith, and religion has also given us. Additionally, I specifically chose this text because MCC has allowed me to explore my religious identity in the past couple of years, to the point where I've come to accept this passage on queer futurity as part of my faith and religious practice. So today I wanted to spend the rest of our time together to reflect on some of our important history as a church. I will be reflecting on what a lot of us think about as the three stages of MCC as a denomination. First, as the gay church from its founding in the late 60s and 70s, to the church with AIDS in the 80s and early 90s, and what MCC is known as today in the present, the queer church. In reminding us of some of the important history of our denomination, I thought it would inspire us to think about how MCC has played a pivotal role in this idea of queer future, and how we can continue to be this place for hope in the LGBTQ+ community and outside it as well. In the first stages of our church, MCC was often identified as the gay church, as it was the first religious community that was for and by gay people. We all know the story, and Mark told it today, of how Reverend Perry first started MCC in his apartment in LA with 12 people on October 6, 1968. I want to mention a side note in that I think it's super interesting how during this first sermon by Reverend Troy Perry, Reverend Troy Perry made it clear that this was not a gay church, but we know from the way that other people understood and interpreted MCC, for example, from news clippings during the time period that reported about MCC, that this was in fact understood as the gay church, as there was nothing like it before. From the beginning, Reverend Perry knew that MCC would be important, as he stated that MCC is a church that was organized to serve the religious, spiritual, and social needs of the homosexual community, and that it would grow to reach homosexuals wherever they might be. Reflecting back to Reverend Troy's mission 53 years later, I have to say that I still get goosebumps thinking about all that Reverend Perry's dreaming was able to accomplish. From a broken place after Reverend Perry's attempted suicide, Reverend Perry was able to create a church that embodied the queer future. From Reverend Perry's vision, MCC was able to organize the first pride parades, the first same-sex marriages, and the building of hundreds of MCC locations around the world. MCC has been able to serve and continue to serve as a safe haven for LGBTQ+ folks who have been rejected from religious communities and society as a whole. Along with this first sermon 53 years ago, Reverend Perry also announced the first mission of MCC, salvation, community, and Christian social action. I think it's crazy that these three missions have stood firm and grounded MCC for half a decade. Salvation meant that MCC welcomed everyone, and MCC was able to do this by offering the first open communion. Community meant that MCC served as a place where LGBTQ+ people can safely gather and build relationships with one another. And Christian social action demanded that the church advocated for rights in both the secular and religious world to fight oppression, discrimination, and homophobia. Christian social action became the most critical mission for our denomination as it inspired MCC members to fight injustices like during the AIDS and HIV epidemic. The second stage of our church has been known as the Church with AIDS. I spent most of my senior year in college understanding this history of our denomination, and I've learned that MCC has been a pivotal space for the gay community during the 80s. As many of the congregational members know, experienced, and remember, the US government during the times of the AIDS crisis in the 80s denied to acknowledge that a plague was happening within our community. Hospitals and doctors would refuse to treat gay men with HIV and AIDS, and gay men were thrown into dumpsters in black trash bags when they passed away, as too many people were dying too quickly. It was stigmatized for gay men to gather in large groups in fear they would spread the virus. In a scary world where gay men were dying constantly and being outcasted, MCC became the meeting grounds for gay men to find support, grieve their loved ones, and build coalitions. Additionally, our history tells us of our lesbian and women congregational members caring for the men who were dying, essentially being the only people who would even go near gay men. I researched all about how MCC was the place where AIDS ministries were created, where gay pastors, even on their deathbeds, preached about how God loved the LGBTQ+ community and manifested the future free of AIDS and death. Reverend Perry even took to the political stage and began debating people like Jerry Falwell, demanding that God did not create AIDS to abolish homosexuality. In one of the darkest moments of LGBTQ+ history in the United States, MCC opened its doors to those that were suffering. Our church served as one of the last hope for these men and a place where queer futurity was being imagined. Lastly, today, MCC is known as the queer church because it is the church for the people in the margins. We no longer focus solely on LGBTQ+ liberation, but as a denomination, we stand as the vanguard of civil and human rights movements by addressing issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, economies, climate change, age, and global human rights. Today, MCC as a queer church means that it still provides a space for hope, and our work is still important, as many people still feel discrimination, hatred, fear, outcast, especially inside religious spaces. While putting together this week's sermon, I reflected heavily on why I still come to MCC, even though I have been atheist for a couple of years now, or why I still consider MCC to be my sole place of worship and the place where I experience genuine religiosity. I think that it is because it is only at MCC where I truly understand what it means to create a queer space that launches you into the queer future. MCC has created a home for LGBTQ people and queer liberation. It was one of the first places in the world where us as queer people were able to be ourselves. So as we celebrate our anniversary today, I hope that we remember that the work that we are called to do as members of MCC and to continue to fight in order to create a better and queer future. Thank you.